Hey, it's me, it's Jeff, and if you followed me on Twitter in the past few months, you might have seen me do these Game Boy style pixel art portraits. Now, enough people have asked me how to do these that I thought it'd be great to show you exactly how I create these in Aseprite, which is the app I use on Windows. So if you like this video at any time, please give me a like or subscribe or a comment. I'm still trying to grow the channel, so all the feedback I get helps me create much better tutorials for y'all. Anyways, here is the tutorial. Now, before we begin, I actually want to show you something with Aseprite that's a little interesting. So I've made a palette here that's 160 by 160. Now, when you are trying to put something in like a reference layer here, it doesn't actually work the way you might want it to. So I had this large portrait of Carly Rae Jepsen, and you can see that the reference layer is actually not editable. I can move it, but I can't actually resize it. So if I wanted to have her face take up the whole canvas, I actually can't do that with a reference layer. So there are ways around it that may or may not be exactly how you want them to work, but here's a technique that I've been using to get reference layers to work. So immediately you might think, okay, I can open the photo in Photoshop and then highlight the area I want and just copy and paste that into Aseprite. And that's correct, but not entirely correct. So let me show you what happens when you do that with a full-size image. So you see, you can resize it, but it sort of moves very slowly and has trouble figuring it out. And then sometimes it will automatically crop it. So you don't have the flexibility you think you might want if you would copy and paste a full-size image. So that's not exactly the way you want to do it to start off. So what you can do is actually highlight the area you want and then crop it and then resize it to the size of the canvas you have. Of course, when you do this, it's going to make the picture look pixelated, which is fine because you're creating pixel art. So that's a good place to start. So I got this picture from my friend Miguel. He is starting a new Twitch channel, I think, so he wanted to make a cool icon for his Twitch page, his Twitter, his website, and things like that. So I told him to send me a selfie and I would work from there. Now, the good thing about the selfie is that it's actually not a straight-on selfie. You can see his head's a little tilted. So what's cool is when you do paste in an image, it actually treats it like a pixel layer. So you can actually rotate it, which is really cool. So I just put the line down the middle just to make sure it's symmetrical, and then I started drawing on it. And that's actually really awesome because you can manipulate them that way if they're the right size and it's not a big problem. Of course, you see I undid a few things there, and that's actually a good mistake that I wanted to leave in, because when you paste in a layer, it treats it like a pixel layer. So you actually can draw directly on it and edit it. Of course, when we're using a reference photo, you don't want to draw over the reference photo. You want to be able to look at it when you need to. So I made a new layer above it and started drawing. So the main goal when you're starting it out is you want to just do main shapes. So in Miguel's case, the main shapes of his face are his beard, his eyebrows, his eyes, and his nostrils. And when you're starting out, these probably won't be perfect when you're doing it, so just leave them as landmarks to begin with. Don't focus on trying to get them pixel perfect the first time, because you'll start tweaking them over time. And as I'm drawing, you'll see that there's times where I will make the pixel layer a little bit transparent so I can use that as a guide. And then much later when I'm doing finer details and tweaking it, I'm actually just looking at a reference photo of him to get those exact details in. And so for the purposes of the video, I actually will now just have a photo of him on the left side of the screen, because while I'm drawing this, now that I have his face covered with pixels, I'm looking at a reference photo on another monitor while I'm drawing. And I think it's good to use both in tandem, not to lean on one too heavily, because you're losing a little bit if you're just simply tracing over it. There's no artistic difference. There's no style to it if you're just drawing over someone's face. In that case, anyone can do that. But I like to use that sort of trace over method just as a guide to get started. And then once I have most of the main shapes and details down, we'll just look at a reference photo and tweak things that don't feel right to me. Because even if you are drawing over someone's face, not all the details will be perfect. You can see here, like, some of the guide shapes I left for the nose aren't perfect, or they weren't specific enough for me to draw his nose correctly. So his nose is actually something I go over a few times, and I focus more on just simply looking at it to determine the right shapes for it over time. So this will change a little bit more. It'll look more like him later on, but as I was drawing this, I felt like it's close, but there's things that weren't right in the way it looked when I first started. And so I was using more of traditional drawing techniques to better understand what was wrong with my representation of his face. So here I'd actually just go back to a transparent layer really quick just to get the general shape of his lips. And actually we'll change those a little later on. And in traditional drawing, when you're drawing a portrait, you can't draw parts of a face or anything that you're representing in a vacuum. So see, the fact that it's so zoomed in is that I'm missing certain details of his face that you can use as guide points. So relating the end of his lips to where his pupils are, to his nose, to the arc of his eyebrows, you can use all those things as a general guidepost to make sure that the pixel art looks good. And especially if you're trying to stylize your pixel art, it's good to have some foundational portrait drawing techniques to make sure you're actually representing a face really well, because, you know, in traditional portrait drawing, you're doing pen or paint, and you have so much more flexibility. In pixel art, you have such a limited amount of space. And so once you get most of the big details out of the way, it's these fine choices you make in pixel placement and colors that make the big difference in making sure you're actually representing the look of something perfectly. So I actually like to be, in a way, kind of messy. Like, this may or may not look messy to you, but it looks messy to me right now. And that's good because then I can start refining the areas that don't feel right to me. So you'll see several times in this video where even though it's sped up, you'll see that it sort of stops for a minute because I'm literally looking at what I've drawn on my monitor and then looking at the reference photo and comparing areas visually just by looking at them where things feel off. And so even if you're looking at it now, there's a few immediate areas that are not correct right now. The shadows around his eyes are a little bit too feminine. His nose shape is nowhere near correct. His lips are a little bit too big. And so that's where it's helpful to actually look at your drawing and look at your reference and use those sort of things as a guidepost, like seeing where the pupils interact with the edge of the nose, where the pupils interact to the edge of the lips, where the nose is centered on the face, how all of these things relate to one another. Because even if you're drawing over, you can see I'm trying to do it again just to tighten it up a little bit. But over time, when I actually get to the final version of the drawing, I'm actually just relying on my eye instead of simply drawing over it. Because pixel art, it's so imprecise in a way, so you can't do certain things. Like, there's certain shapes you just can't make. But if you look at his nose, the way the top part, bulges out a little bit, if you were drawing that with a pencil, they're fine lines you can draw that actually will make it really easy to render. But in pixel art, you can't get a final level of detail, so you have to find broad approximates that will get you there. But generally speaking, things you want to be mindful of while you're making a sort of pixel art portrait, or a handful of things, are what are the main defining features? And that should always be probably your most darkest areas. So again, in Miguel's case, it's his eyebrows and his beard and his eyes. Then what are secondary areas? And those secondary areas can be either the shadows you want to represent or highlights you want to represent. And so since I didn't want to put too much detail into the top of the nose, because that would make everything seem a little bit deeper than it is, I instead focused on using a highlight. So you can see that the lighter color in the center represents the depth in his nose. Of course, you can see here I'm trying to figure out which shapes make sense for the nose here. And again, you don't want to put because when you're putting these dark lines here, even though it's the sort of second to last dark color in the gradient here, those lines make a big difference in determining a shape overall. So I'm trying to look at his photo and seeing where are the main lines that generate the shape. So that's definitely the bottom of the nose and nostrils, and then sort of very bottom of the curve of the nostril. Those where the main shapes lie. And there's also a little bit of a shape where the top of the nose juts out a little bit. You don't have to draw the full thing because that would make the height of his nose look really big. But if you put two little dots there and then have the lighter color represent the rest of the form, it kind of makes it look a little bit more realistic. And also I realized that there wasn't much of a bridge of a nose, so I was making his face look a little bit too flat. So I drew in some side lines on the side of the bridge of the nose to give his face a little bit more depth. And the eyes, you can see I changed them a little bit more, arcing them downwards instead of upwards, because if you arc the edge of the eye a little bit more upwards. It's a more of a feminine look, and that's not necessarily how Miguel's face looks. It sort of does, but not really. So I decided to take a little bit of a artistic license here and kind of arc them down a little bit. And you can see here the lips, I kind of struggle with them for a little bit. Lips, in some cases, are actually kind of hard to do in pixel art because there's so many different ways you can do it. You can just do a simple line. You can do highlights. Especially when you do lips by themselves, they're not that hard. But for some reason, when someone has a beard, there's a lot of different dimensions you have there, and that can kind of change the form a lot. And you can see I use the lighter color to pull in his lips a little bit more. And you can't see it as I'm relating it there, but what I'm doing is I'm looking at his photo and noticing where the edge of his nose and the edge of his lips are in relation to one another and trying to match that on the pixel art. And again, I'm experimenting with different ways to generate the highlights of his lips, but I think it was a pretty close approximation there. And then nearing the end of the drawing, there's a few things just to keep in mind as you're making tweaks, or just even when you're starting off a drawing like this, is being mindful of where is the darkest area and where is the lightest area, and making sure those are highlighted in the portrait, and then figuring out what are the values in between. Of course, when you're doing a drawing that's you only have access to 4 colors, those decisions have to be really well considered, especially when you're thinking about what is the darkest area, what is the lightest area, and how do I represent the mid-tone, because you only have really 2 colors to do that, and that becomes really difficult. So doing these is always a bit of a challenge because, you know, the face has so many different planes and round edges, hard edges, and you can't represent all of them all at the same time, especially when you're working with an incredibly limited palette and you're working with a very small canvas size. So it's a bit difficult. It takes time to do. But again, when you're thinking of traditional portrait drawing techniques, figuring out where your main landmarks are. As long as one of your main landmarks is correctly positioned, for instance, the eyes, you can relate the edges of the eyes to the edge of the nose, or the angle, the angle of where this meets that. You can relate those together. And over time, you can keep building on these relationships to make sure the drawing makes sense. And then from there, you can add your own little artistic touches here and there. But proportional wise, it's always good to have one physical landmark perfectly represented. And in this case, when you're just drawing over drawing over a reference photo, that's pretty easy to do. And from there, you can either draw over the rest of the main landmarks and then use your eye to do it, or just use your eye in general. But I think a mix of both makes pixel art portraits really fun to do and also just easier to do. So don't rely on one or the other. Use both of them in tandem. And over time, your level of comfort will increase. I look back at some of my older ones. They're not that good. But as I've learned actual traditional portrait drawing techniques and taking pencil drawing classes, it has actually helped my pixel art portraits a lot more, because it's helping me use the same visual techniques to make sure that proportions look right, that forms look correct. It takes a bit of experimenting, but I think the more you do these, the better you'll get at them. So if you enjoyed this, please, again, leave a like, a comment. I would love it if you subscribed. I'm still trying to grow this channel, still trying to give people as many art tutorials as I can. I love doing these, and I love teaching people the most. So leave a comment if there's anything else you want to learn. I'm going to be doing more of these individual videos. I hopefully you like them. If you do like them, let me know. I would love to basically show you how to do every piece of art that I make. So if you like that, please leave a comment, subscribe, like, tweet at me, do whatever you like. And if you really, really want to support me, there's a Patreon link right below in the video description. That's the most direct way to support me. And of course, people who are patrons have much more control over helping me figure out what I want to do. So thanks so much. Thanks so much for watching. I really appreciate it. And I will see y'all folks in the next video.